Nicola and say welcome to Nicola.
Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome, Sue, and for inviting me to come and talk to everybody this evening. It's an absolute pleasure. As you mentioned, my name's Nicola Cornick and I'm an author and a historian who lives locally to Lambourn. So it's a particular pleasure to be invited to talk to this group this evening. And history has always been my passion. I studied it at college twice, and I'm planning on going back to study it for a third time, so there's no putting me off from history. I work on a voluntary basis at two stately homes, at Ashdown House, which of course is just up the road from Lambourn, and at Lydiard Park in Wiltshire, the other side of Swindon. I read about history, I write about history, and this evening I'm talking about how I research the history behind my novels and turn this into fiction. That's the core of the talk, at any rate. I am going to be taking a few detours along the way into favourite books, influential authors, childhood reading, a little bit about the craft of writing and various other history and writing related topics. But that's the joy of talking to a library-based audience, because I always find we have so many books and authors in common. And I hope you enjoy the talk, and at the end I will be very happy to take any questions that people have. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully you can all hear me and see, you'll be able to see the slides as well, but do let me know if there are any problems. So here we go. Good, hopefully that's working okay. So as I say, it is absolutely lovely to be able to chat with you this evening. Before I start, I'd really like to say thank you. This is the last talk I'm doing this year, and it's been an exceptional couple of years, and for a lot of writers, for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. But I would like to thank all the readers, librarians, booksellers, reviewers, and everybody to do with books for all the support that you've given me, and indeed my writing career, not just in the last 2 years, but over the past 20 years. I'm now what is officially referred to as a veteran author, which did make me feel as though I ought to look like this. That's me trying to move my slide on, and now it isn't moving on. Bear with me a moment. Sorry. Okay. Right, we'll try that again. And go to full screen. So yes, here we go, a real veteran author. In fact, for many years when I turned up to give talks on books and writing, people actually expected me to look like Dame Barbara, and were generally extremely disappointed, because that's what they thought a historical novelist should look like, and of course I don't. Unfortunately, my dog is a Labrador, and try as I might, I cannot get him to fit under my arm. But actually Dame Barbara is kind of influential in so many people's historical fiction reading, and I'm no exception to that. I mentioned that history had always been my passion, and I actually discovered historical fiction through my grandmother, who loved to read novels of all different sorts. My grandmother's here on the left. I hope you're seeing the screen the same way around that I am. She's the one without the pearls in the coat. And she was an extraordinary woman, very, very influential in my life. But she hid her fiction books at the back of her wardrobe, maybe because she thought that they were simply too racy for me to find and read as a child. But being a curious child and enjoying searching through her wardrobe anyway, I soon came across them at the back. And they were the books that introduced me to the writings of authors such as Georgette Heyer, Jean Plaidy, Anna Seton, Mary Stuart, and of course Daphne du Maurier, whose portrait is the other one here, The Lady in the Pearls. Between them, all of these authors' books, in fact, fostered in me a love of all the the elements that I now try to bring out in my own writing. They wrote fascinating historical characters. They brought in elements of suspense and intrigue into their stories, and they always wrote a very powerful sense of place. And what I love most about Daphne du Maurier's writing is, in fact, her evocative descriptions. She really uses language to create a completely different world for a reader to inhabit, a world you can get lost in. And I think that also applies to authors like Mary Stuart, whether she was writing about the Greek islands or Scotland or King Arthur and ancient Britain. The talent to create different worlds is one that I hugely admire in other authors, whatever genre of fiction that they're writing in. And I do try to emulate that. And building the setting and the atmosphere of a book is very important to me. And I think in that respect, I am particularly fortunate because of the area that we live in. Of course, I'm right on the corner of Wiltshire, Berkshire and Oxfordshire, and this area is crammed absolutely full of history and indeed ancient buildings. And there are so many stories and so many legends to draw on. Now, you often hear writers say that they knew from their earliest childhood that they wanted to be an author. I didn't particularly have that ambition, but as you can see, I was a studious child, already dressed in school uniform at about the age of 2 here. Both my parents were academics, and the only published author I knew was my godmother, Patricia Joan Hunt, who was a published author. She seemed quite a rarefied, exciting creature to me. She wrote books with religious themes, and you may recognise a couple of the books that she wrote for the Ladybird series, What to Look For Inside the Church, What to Look For Outside the Church, and various other books of that nature. And I have a signed copy of all of her books and can remember that in each one she always wrote the same words, to Nicola, with love from her godmother, the author. And it all sounded so mysterious and exciting to me to be an author. It was just quite delightful. I also went to school in an 18th century mansion that had been the dower house of the Countesses of Harewood at Harewood House in Yorkshire. And I can still remember the huge sweeping wooden staircase there and all the old corridors that seemed to lead straight back into the past. And of course, it had a wonderful library as well. So with such influences on me as a child, I think it probably was no surprise that I was drawn towards history and historical fiction in particular. And that, as I say, I never actually intended to become a writer as such. But this is a genuine anecdote that in my teens, I used to go to the library in North Leeds, where I lived, every week to get my hands on as many historical fiction books as I could. And I had no real understanding of the publishing or writing process at that stage, because I couldn't understand why there weren't new books every single week for me to read, why people weren't writing so quickly that they would be able to provide new things. And I really got quite frustrated by this, and the librarians were obliged to explain to me that it just simply didn't work as fast as that. And I can remember thinking at the grand old age of about 15, well, in that case, I should write my own book. How difficult can it be? Well, that was how I inadvertently stumbled into becoming a writer. As it turned out, it could be very difficult indeed. It took me 12 years to get my first book published. It was a Regency romance, very much in the style of Georgette Heyer. I still do love the Regency period. And I wrote lots of Regencies over the following years, about 15 years. At the back of my mind, though, was always the urge to write something else, a longer historical novel that would need more research and have more space in it, more word count, if you like, for me to explore history in more depth. But even when I was writing my Regencies, I absolutely loved to put local stories, local legends into those books. And I remember there's a house in Ashbury that was the model for one of the houses in one of my early Regency stories. So I was already at that age building our local history into my books. But when I was looking around for a focus for that, the bigger sort of historical novels, I really found my inspiration for that at Ashdown. I'm sure all of you recognise it, even if you're not local. You've probably seen me feature it very many times on my social media and other things, because it's a place I'm so attached to, so fond of. And I've been a volunteer guide and historian for the National Trust there for almost 20 years now. I knew for a long time that I wanted to write a fictionalised account of Ashdown's history and the story of the people who were associated with it. And by fictionalised, I mean that I wanted to use the existing historical facts, if you like, as an authentic framework on which to hang the story. So the book would combine historical fact with imagination. Now, I love this slide. It's a quotation, in fact, of Mr. Gradgrind from Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. We want facts is what we want, facts, not opinions. Now, a lot of people, of course, think that history is full of facts. I would beg to differ a bit on that, because I think one of the lessons I took to heart from my master's degree in history particularly was that the gap between historical non-fiction, the gap between history writing and historical fiction, is actually smaller than a lot of people think. Because anybody who's writing a narrative, whether it's fictional or otherwise, has to join up the facts to create a story. Both fiction and non-fiction contain viewpoint, the viewpoint of the person who is writing, and also speculation to a degree greater in fiction, obviously, than in non-fiction. But if you think about it, a description of a battle, for example, depends on who's writing it. Which side were they on? What were they interested in? What was their perspective? If you think of the archaeology programs on TV, people stand around a lot and speculate when they've found something. You know, what was it used for? If they don't know, they say it was a ritual object, and that usually covers so many things. So in the end, it's all about how you tell the story. And I think that in the gaps between the historical facts, that's where a historical fiction author's imagination can roam. The book that came out of my interest in Ashdown House was called House of Shadows, and rather beautifully it features Ashdown on the cover, a cover that was actually based on, the design was based on a photograph taken by my husband. And Ashdown, I'm sure many of you know, is a very intriguing place. All the people who work there seem to become completely enthralled by the history of it, and particularly the story of the love affair between William, 1st Earl of Craven, who built the house, and Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Bohemia, who was the sister of King Charles I. And it was this story of this relationship that inspired me to write House of Shadows. It's a mystery set in 3 different time periods. In the 17th century, of course, when William Craven and Elizabeth Stuart were alive, but also there's a Regency thread to it and a modern day one as well. And I very much came to write House of Shadows from the perspective of a romance author. I think it was the love story that hooked me in the first place. But then once I kind of got into that, a rather odd thing happened. I started to mix in elements of other genres of fiction, a bit of mystery, a bit of crime, lots of local legend and superstition. And this had all really been prompted by the research that I was doing into the background subject. So in the end, I ended up with a book that contained a missing persons case. I think there was some arson in there. There were 2 suspicious deaths. There was a romantic story as well. And as if that wasn't enough, in the book, I actually burned Ashdown House down and had it as a ruin, which not only confused a lot of the people who know it, of course, but also upset quite a lot of people as well. And I am forced to agree that that bit of the story was not historically authentic at all. But that book was really a learning curve for me in many ways, because it crystallized the elements of writing that particularly interest me and which I include in each of my books, and Sue made some reference to this at the beginning. There's always a figure from history, it's usually a woman, but not always, whose story has been lost or neglected. I call them women from the footnotes of history. There's often a historical mystery as well, and there's a historic site, often a ruined house, or as I say in the case of Ashdown, if it isn't ruined, I will make it a ruin. And it's all about the myths and the legends that surround that. As a sort of side step from that, for anybody who's interested in writing time slip fiction, as it's called, or dual time books, I did discover in the process of writing House of Shadows that a book that entwines 2 or 3 different time periods is, for me anyway, extremely difficult to write. Because I'm not a writer who plans very much. I tend to be what's known as a pantser, a writer who flies by the seat of their pants. So when I set off writing, I don't necessarily know where the story's going to go or where the characters are going to take it, and that's not too bad in a linear kind of a narrative. But if you're trying to entwine it like a tapestry with 1 or 2 other story threads, one contemporary one or another historical one, you can get me into all kinds of knots. Sometimes it took me up a blind alley and or into a corner that you have to plot yourself out of. And it actually took me 2 years to write House of Shadows when I'd only planned on it taking 1. That was how complicated I found it. But I was very fortunate. House of Shadows found a home with HarperCollins with their HQ imprint, and they were happy for me to carry on writing books that mixed all these different elements of different genres together, even though I think it probably still, even now, provides a challenge in terms of how you actually brand and market books like this, which is obviously very important to publishers and booksellers. Meanwhile, my problem was that I was faced with coming up with another similar but different story. And I was a bit stumped for a while because I hadn't thought that far ahead. But I knew again that I could draw on history local to this area to come up with something that I found really fascinating, and hopefully it would interest other people as well. And in fact, as it's turned out so far, it was my most popular and best-selling dual time book so far, The Phantom Tree. I have again to thank my grandmother for giving me the idea for this book in a roundabout way. She had on her shelf or in her wardrobe a box of 6 gold books, 1 each, about the wives of Henry VIII. I don't know if anybody else remembers these, but there was one for each wife and written by a different person. And they were published in the 1970s by, I think, Cornick. And I was absolutely entranced by these. Well, the wives, the whole story led me to a particular interest in the Tudor period for years and years. And in the book about Catherine Parr, it mentioned that she married Thomas Seymour, one of the Seymours of Wolf Hall, after the death of Henry VIII, and had a child called Mary Seymour. And for years, I wondered what had happened to this baby, because Catherine had died giving birth to Mary, and then Mary herself disappeared from the historical record at the age of only 2. And at the back of my mind was always this question: what happened to Mary Seymour? And that was actually the question that was at the heart of The Phantom Tree. Again, as with House of Shadows, I was intrigued by a real historical figure. In the case of Elizabeth of Bohemia, Elizabeth Stuart, the Winter Queen, she wasn't a very well-known person, but she wasn't lost from history. But it felt to me as though Mary Seymour had been completely lost. And the picture that kind of fed into this story, because I quite often have portraits as part of my research, and I'll say a little bit about that later on. This picture belongs to my husband's uncle, and it's supposed to be a painting of Anne Boleyn. But as soon as I saw this, I thought, what if that was Mary Seymour? And I think this illustrates how a writer kind of is a bit like a magpie. Ideas come together from so many different places. We pick up all sorts of shiny ideas and things that take our fancy and bring them all together to make a story. So in the case of the Phantom Tree, there was this historical figure, Mary Seymour, the mystery of what had happened to her. There was an old portrait, and there was a local setting, of course, this time Wolf Hall and Stabernack Forest near Marlborough. And this I've included this slide because it shows that there is literally nowhere that I won't go in order to research my novels, because this is me going down the original 16th century sewers at Wolf Hall. And it was obviously an invitation I simply couldn't refuse. I love my research, and I frequently get distracted down various rabbit holes when I should really be writing. But I have to admit, this was the first time that I'd ever been invited down a 16th century sewer. But it was an interesting exercise, simply because Wolf Hall, the Wolf Hall that was actually standing at the time in the Tudor period, when the Seymour family, of course, were so high in favour, and Jane Seymour was Queen of England. That Wolf Hall has disappeared now, but underground, the sewers, what underpins it, the foundations, are still there. So in order to get an idea of the structure and the extent of the original house, going underground was one of the best ways to do that. I do tend to do the research for a book first, and this starts with reading up on the general historical period to give me the framework for the book. And that usually comes from secondary sources, from reference books and historical non-fiction. And after I've sort of immersed myself in the period of history that I'm writing about, then I'll focus in specifically on the details that I need to know. So, for example, there's so many things once you realise that you're trying to build a historical world. What is it like, for example, to be a member of the gentry in Tudor times? What sort of pattern did your life follow if you lived in a small manor house? What did you eat? What did people wear? What sort of work did the servants do? All of the minutiae of life needs to be there in your mind in order to be able to create this accurate historical framework. But of course, not that much of that minutiae needs to go into the book, otherwise you completely bog it down with detail. But I always feel, I think of the historical detail that you get from research as being like the foundations of a building, if you like. It's the structure that you build the book upon. But as you can see from this picture, my favourite part of research is always to visit the places where I set my books, because that enables you generally to walk the paths that your characters have trod, and it gives me, and I think a lot of authors feel this, a real sense of place, a real feeling for the place that they're writing about. And I do this for every book if I can. When I was researching the Phantom Tree, another of the places I went to was Great Bedwin Church to view the tomb of Sir John Seymour, who was Mary's grandfather and the father of Thomas and Jane Seymour. In the same church as this memorial is this extraordinary glass from the original Wolf Hall. It said it was taken there when the medieval Wolf Hall was destroyed and put into the church. And I think seeing things like this, it takes you so close to the past. These are literally artifacts from the period that I'm writing about. And so my characters would have seen these things or touched them. They would have been a part of their life. And that's the bit I think that as a writer, you can really, you can sort of plug into that sense. It's incredible and inspiring to feel that as a direct line to the history that you're writing about. And also a lot of fun comes from the myths and legends that I bring into my books and that we have in such abundance around here. Part of the Phantom Tree is set at Littlecote House near Hungerford, which belonged to the Darrell family, who were actually related by marriage to the Seymours. and exploring Littlecote and its ghost stories was very interesting. And after I'd heard about the story of the ghost of Wild Will Darrell at Littlecote, I went away to find out about the historical character of Will Darrell, because so often I find that within local folklore there is a grain of historical truth. And I think one of the things I like the most about Will Darrell is the fact that in the 19th century he had a horse named after him. He's such a part of our local folklore and our local stories that there's a horse called Wild Darrell, and it's named after a 16th century real character from history. And that's the kind of thing that I just find absolutely fascinating. Another example of searching out the myths and legends and sort of bringing them into my stories occurred when I wrote The Woman in the Lake, which is a book that's set at Lydiard. This is Lydiard Park, as I say, an 18th century house just near Swindon. And Swindon actually, I mean, I wrote quite a lot about the history of Swindon for The Woman in the Lake, and it has a very interesting pre-railway, pre-industrial history, when the old town, the little town on the hill, was a notable spot to visit for its clean air and health-giving spa waters. Again, The Woman in the Lake was inspired by another remarkable but almost forgotten woman from history, very different in this instance, Lady Diana Spencer, the second of that name. I think the Princess of Wales was the third, or possibly more than that. But the second Lady Diana Spencer was married to Viscount Bolingbroke and lived at Lydiard in the mid-18th century. And again, she is a fascinating woman who we just really don't hear much about, but she was exceptional in the sense that after their scandalous divorce, she turned a hobby for drawing and painting into a way to make a living in order to be able to support herself and her family. And of course, this was practically unheard of for an aristocratic woman in that particular era. And she produced designs for Wedgwood pottery, which are still actually in use today. I think she was an extraordinary woman. And again, you know, we really just don't hear much about her. But the folklore element in The Woman in the Lake was to do with smuggling and the stories of the Wiltshire moonrakers. Tied up in this idea is the folklore that Wiltshire, and indeed the part of Berkshire that we're in, was an active market for smugglers in the 18th century. And this had always puzzled me, because I thought, well, we're an awfully long way from the sea here. How could that possibly have been the case? Again, you know, when I came to do my research for that, I looked at the criminal records from the period, the people who were being tried in the assizes and the courts. And I discovered it was absolutely true, that there was a network of smugglers that stretched from the south coast up across Salisbury Plain to towns such as Devizes and Swindon. And from there, the contraband was dispersed eastwards into Oxfordshire and Berkshire and north to Birmingham. And the bit I like the most about this story, as well as being astonished by the complexity and the organisation that went into this smuggling operation, but the bit I liked best was that it was not actually mostly about brandy and other spirits. The most popular contraband in 18th century Wiltshire and Berkshire was actually tea. So far from people hiding endless barrels of brandy in all the local ponds, they were actually hiding tea away. But rather funny that. So I'm moving on now to a couple of other things that I find particularly inspiring when I'm researching a novel. And letters and paintings are amongst my favourite sources for research, and I have used both letters and paintings in my two most recent books. Portraits really are a wonderful resource for detail, provided, of course, that they are contemporary to the period that you're writing about. Last year, I had a book published that was called The Forgotten Sister, It was about Amy Robsart, the wife of Robert Dudley, who was the favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, there are no confirmed portraits of Amy, but it is thought that this was Amy. And we know a little bit about this picture. It was painted by the miniaturist Lavinia Teelink, and it's thought to have been painted in about 1550. It's very tiny, and it was done ahead of Robert Dudley and Amy's wedding. And it actually shows, you can't see the detail because unfortunately the quality of the picture is not that great, but the badge that she is wearing on the bodice of her gown has actually got an oak leaf and gilly flowers around it. Gilly flowers were a sign of marriage in those days, and the oak leaf was Robert Dudley's roebuck. It was a pun on the word roebuck for oak of his name Robert. So those clues have led people to suggest that this was actually Amy Robsart. We do have physical descriptions of Amy Robsart from other people, but very little about her in her own words. She's another of the women from the footnotes of history. But there is one letter that's written in her own hand, which again I drew on for research for the story, because reading people's letters, of course, is like hearing them speak. It's listening to their voice directly. It might be slightly different than if you were entering into conversation with them, but you are going straight into their thoughts and into their words. And the letter that Amy had written was to the steward of her Norfolk estates, discussing the wool yield from the sheep that were grazed there. And so whilst we might not know a lot about Amy, we can judge from this one letter the fact that she was educated and articulate, and she was clearly very well versed in matters of business. And I found this particularly interesting because the Amy that I had read about, admittedly in the sparse details in the texts in books I'd read, really was nothing more than just some kind of frivolous person who wasn't really drawn particularly clearly, other than that some historians had used her tailor's bills to suggest that she was very extravagant about the amount that she spent on clothes. And I think this is a good example of the sort of bias that sometimes creeps into descriptions of women from the footnotes of history. And I've made some notes about these as I've gone along researching these women, because quite often great sort of conclusions are drawn like that. Oh well, she must have been extravagant and frivolous just because one of the few original records that's left happens to be the bills that were sent for the clothes she wore. And I think that, you know, the way that some historians extrapolate that from that it is a bit of a leap, really. In fact, Amy was the wife of a very ambitious courtier, and she dressed to reflect that. And what I also found interesting when I was researching this, and there was so much emphasis put on how much she spent on a piece of silk, was that Robert Dudley himself spent far more on clothes than his wife did, and indeed on many other material items. And yet no one drew attention to that fact, or indeed to the fact that the estates that were funding the both of them had actually been Amy's inheritance, not Robert's. Another insight into Amy's character can be gained from the testimony of other people after her death, when they all described her as a kind and virtuous person. Her servants had been devoted to her, and that's a pretty good indication of somebody's character, I think, because it's all based on the way that she treated them. Again, the same can't be said for her husband, Robert Dudley, who didn't have quite such a good reputation, but those of you who've read The Forgotten Sister will probably guess that I didn't like him very much. But the big mystery at the heart of The Forgotten Sister was the mystery of Amy's death at Cumnor Place, which again is quite local to us. It's only 20 miles away from here. She died in 1560. She mysteriously fell down the stairs at Cumnor, and from that day to this, historians have never been able to decide for certain whether she fell, whether she jumped, or whether she was pushed. And so it's a really huge historical mystery, and I very much enjoyed tackling that from Amy's perspective rather than from the usual perspective you have on this particular story, which of course much is made of the relationship between Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley and the fact that they were so devoted to each other. But I find Amy's relationship with Robert and indeed with Elizabeth, that sort of triangle, very interesting. And the mystery of Amy's death is one of those perennial mysteries which I'm sure will carry on fascinating people for as long as it already has, for centuries. Which brings me neatly, sorry, and that's, yes, the Forgotten Sister, the book that I wrote about Amy. Yes, brings me neatly on to the biggest historical mystery I've tackled so far, this story of what happened to the princes in the Tower, which really is a story that's occupied authors and historians alike for centuries. Was Richard III the wicked uncle who did away with his two young nephews, or has he been maligned by Shakespeare and indeed many others down the centuries? What really happened to the princes in the Tower? And going back to pictures as a source of research, I always enjoy this particular portrait and another very similar one, showing sort of the pictures that enforce the view of two terrified children who look as though they're about to be set upon by thugs sent by their uncle. And one of the things that I swiftly learned when I was using portraits and paintings as a resource, of course, was that you have to check very carefully when they were painted. So this, for example, was dates from the Victorian period. Was very much a part of the movement at that time to depict the princes as the innocent victims of their power-crazed and evil uncle. So in my most recent book, The Last Daughter, I was looking at this big historical mystery, but again, I chose a starting point of a woman from the footnotes of history. And in this case, it was Anne Lovell, who was the wife of Francis Lovell, Richard III's closest friend and ally. And it did occur to me that so many of these women were participants as well as observers in the most extraordinary events of history, but their versions of these stories have never been told. In Anne Lovell's case, it's particularly difficult, of course, because we're talking about the 15th century here. We don't have any portraits to draw on. She hasn't made that much of an impression on history. I consider some of these people as a bit like ghosts flitting across the scenes of history, really. We do have a testimony of some other people to illuminate her character. For example, from her husband's will speaks of her very affectionately and very generously. And she's mentioned in the Paston letters, which refer to the way in which after Francis Lovell had disappeared after the Battle of Bosworth, Anne is known to be looking for him. She's sending people out trying to find out what's happened to him, even though he's an attainted traitor. So all of this speaks to the loyalty and determination of a woman who wasn't just a passive observer of history. And once I started to look at Anne, I became particularly intrigued with her, because in fact she belonged to the Neville family. She was related to one of the most powerful and influential families during the Wars of the Roses. Of course, via the Neville family, she was related to Warwick, the Kingmaker, Cicely Neville, the matriarch, who was the mother of both King Edward IV and Richard III. And these Cicely Neville and the women of the Neville family were particularly strong women who took an active role in politics. Again, you don't hear that much about it. People are writing about it a bit more now, and it's very interesting to see it from that perspective. And I could see from reading about Anne that she had all of these Neville qualities: the determination, the pride, the idea that she understood statecraft just as well as any man might do. And I could see how influential she might have been in this story. And I was fascinated to look at the story of the princes in the Tower from the perspective of somebody who would have been so close to it and would have known what had happened to them. The ruined house in The Last Daughter, of course, is Minster Lovell here in the picture. Again, only about 20 miles away in Oxfordshire. But a scene in the book, my favourite scene, in fact, was actually I set in Ashbury. Again, there was maybe a small amount of a historical novelist's imagination in that. The events of it did really happen and could have happened in Ashbury. So I decided that was probably definitely where they would have done. And I also, in fact, come back to Ashbury and the Vale of the White Horse for my new book, which will be coming out next year. So this area and its history continues to provide me with wonderful inspiration for my books, and I'm really happy to have been invited to share some of that with you this evening. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Sorry, I'm desperately trying to find my unmute. Engrossed in your picture.